welcome. I'm Maria from Sew Through Time, and this time we're going to make an Edwardian S-bend corset and talk a little bit about the misconceptions about corsetry and the differences between modern corsetry and historical corsetry. Now, the corset that we'll be making today is an early Edwardian atelier sylphie pattern that is taken from an antique corset. It is REFW, and I have previously made it once out of coutil. That one I made exactly as it was in the original pattern. But that didn't really fit my body perfectly, and especially since my body changed a little bit after making that, I can't no longer wear it. So I needed to modify the pattern a little bit. I attempted to modify it once last summer, and that did not go well. And I now learned from my mistakes and remade it so that hopefully I can actually make it work for my body. Okay, so here are the changes that I made to this pattern. So the front piece is slightly more curved in at the waist, and it goes further out at the top. The back and the bust gore are the exact same. I don't need to change that. And then the side hip panel is quite a bit different because I need a lot more curve on it. But then the biggest change is here in the back pieces, because the way this back is built is so that there's a much stronger curve here on the actual back piece than on the gore. So what this does is it makes this gore flare out like this, so that it holds this up like this, so that it gives you both room on your hip and on your butt. But what it also does is it angles this really strongly back, so that it accommodates for your back to have more room here. So that when this gets put on a straight angle here on the lacing strip, this basically creates room for your back. But because I don't really have a back, I don't need that. And when I started to fiddle around with making this gore bigger, to give me enough hip room, the problem what this did was that when I kept this the same, what this did was it just made this flare out even stronger in that direction, so that it kind of collapsed at my back towards the center instead of staying like this. So the problem was that then it ended up being too tight on my bust. It started pushing the side, this front piece here, it started pushing this way further back than it was meant to go, and this would just collapse in on itself, and it would be way too tight on my rib cage. So what I did was I changed the angle so that there's a much larger straight bit here before it starts angling out, and I changed the grain direction so that it goes a little bit more like that instead of almost straight, so that when I put this on here, it hopefully keeps this seam much straighter, but still allows for it to flare for my hip and butt.
For my fabric, I'm using a single layer of taffeta. All the seams except the side and back seam are felled. Those I leave with a single seam in case I need to change something. Now as for the grommets, I always use an awl to splay the fibers away from each other instead of breaking them, to keep the corset stronger and prevent breakage at this point.
Okay, so now center back is boned, but nothing else. So I don't dare pull it really tight. But it looks like it has bust room, hip room, and the waist looks fine. So I don't think I need to do anything to it.
So now I fell down the side and back seam. Since I'll be using 7mm zip ties for my boning because they closely resemble synthetic whalebone, I'm cutting 4cm straight grain strips of taffeta for my boning channels. Then the channels are sewn to the inside of the corset. After inserting the boning, I try on the corset to see how far down the boning can go at the front, so that I can still sit comfortably. I'm short-waisted, so this is a point where Edwardian corsets easily become uncomfortable for me. Then I cut off the excess fabric at the bottom edge. I sew a straight seam below the busk to keep the boning above it. This bottom flap will work as an anchor for my garters. The edges are bound in strips of taffeta. Lastly, I sew hooks for lacing at both sides of the back to keep the bulk of the knots away from the waist. And personally, I just find it easier to lace with the hooks by yourself without having the laces constantly slip as you're trying to tie them and come looser. And here it is, the finished corset. I'm not wearing any hip or bust padding in this, so this is just the corset's natural shape. There is a little bit of room at the hip for some padding in case I want it in the future. For reference, my current body measurements are a 38-inch bust, 27-inch waist, 39-inch high hip, and 41.5-inch low hip. In this corset, my measurements are a 38.5-inch bust, 25-inch waist, 40-inch high hip, and a 42-inch low hip. You'll also notice my slightly uneven lacing gap, and that is mostly due to the fact that this is on my body for the second time ever, so it is still breaking into my body, and that kind of unevenness, at least on my body, usually disappears once the corset breaks into my body and my body adjusts to it, and the boning adjusts to my body, so that then I can lace it more evenly.
So this is going to be a very lightweight corset. And that is one of the biggest misconceptions of modern corsetry, and a thing that is only a feature of modern corsetry is really the really thick, heavy corset. A corset does not have to be heavy or thick to create that proper silhouette or to handle the wear and tear of corsetry and waist reduction. It does, however, need to be a sturdy fabric and something that can handle the friction that comes from your outer clothes rubbing against the corset, whether it is a corset cover or the waistbands or whatever. But I think the biggest reason why we have this modern misconception of corsetry having to be really thick and heavy in order to handle that friction and that strain that goes into a corset is basically that we think that, first of all, that the boning does a lot of the work, when actually the boning doesn't do anything except hold the fabric so that it doesn't wrinkle to support the fabric. The actual patterning does all the work for you. And even though historically most women wouldn't tight lace, I have found, at least on my body, that a small reduction usually tends to make corsets much more comfortable. And from what I've talked to other people who wear corsets, that usually tends to be the case for most bodies. And that would probably be what most Victorian and Edwardian women did too. They wouldn't tight lace to an extreme where you try to cringe your waist as small as possible, except for maybe a super fashionable elite and usually only for special occasions. But most women would still reduce their waist a little bit. First of all, that helps keep the corset in place so that it doesn't start riding up your rib cage, and that is painful if that happens. But because the shape is created entirely by the pattern, the fabric actually doesn't need to be super strong as long as it can handle that friction from the outer garments. And that is a big reason why most modern fabrics actually can't handle it, is because our weaves are not as tight as historical fabric weaves would have been, and also our fibers tend to be less rugged and strong and good quality. Cotton especially has gotten a lot worse in quality throughout the years than it was previously. Nowadays, what we consider high quality cotton would probably have been considered in the turn of the century pretty low grade, simply because of our monoculture in growing things. And there's only one type of cotton basically that most of the cotton industry uses. So because of the lack of diversity in the plant itself, we don't have the kind of strong cotton that they had back in the day. And another reason for this is because in the turn of the century, and especially the later you go into the Victorian era, corsets were usually boned with baleen. Baleen, it comes from a whale, and by the turn of the century, it was already getting scarce, and after that, by the 1920s, it really wasn't used anymore at all. It was replaced by metal boning, both flat steel and spring steel. And modern corsets usually use those two types of metal. But the kind of metal we use is thicker than the historical counterparts would have been. And because this boning already is so thick and rugged, and then you add those big caps, and it becomes very bulky on its own, and those metal pieces can easily work their way through fabric. So I think this kind of creates that need to create bulk and strength to keep that boning in, and also to keep that boning from showing with a really strong line through the fabric. Because if you would make a corset with metal spring steel boning out of a very lightweight silk taffeta, for instance, you'd most likely see these really strong ridges where the boning is. And let's see how much this weighs. It weighs 242 grams. And I think that's a pretty typical lightweight corset weight from turn of the century. That's something that wouldn't be coutil. Many other materials were used. Cotton sateen was very common, and also taffeta and different kinds of silks were very common. Now, as for the modern corset. This is a modern custom-made corset, not made for me though, but this is a very well made modern corset. It is lined with coutil, and it is boned mostly with spring steel, and then a metal busk. I wonder if, let me see. Yeah, and then these lacing strip ones are flat steel. There's a modesty panel. This is an underbust corset, so not as big as my Edwardian one. This is made, like I said, it's lined with coutil, and then as an outer layer, it has a fashion fabric of some sort of satin, probably a polyester, and then the pretty lace. And then, of course, this will add bulk and weight, the pretty glitters. But I've taken the laces out of this, so that would add a little bit of weight, but obviously not a lot. Let's see how much this weighs. And this is 453 grams. So this is twice as heavy as this, even though this is a mid-bust corset and this is an underbust one. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of height difference in them. The other huge difference in both this and basically all modern corsets is the way modern corset makers make a corset. The basic structure is the same, but I was originally, when I first got into corsetry and corset making, I actually learned by making modern corsetry. And I was taught by a modern corset maker. And the way I was taught was that you take your measurements, whether it's underbust or overbust or both, and then you take your waist, and then you take your upper hip and any in-between measurements you need to. And then you reduce your waist to the whatever measurement you want to reduce your waist to in the pattern. And that's how you make the pattern. And that results, because it doesn't have any extra room at the hip, it results in a much flatter and less curvy silhouette than a historical corset. And that, at least on my body, creates it so that I can't actually reduce much, especially not comfortably. And it also easily creates spillage at the top and at the bottom of the corset, because there's nowhere for that extra flesh to go. Because even though we talk about reducing, it doesn't actually reduce anything. It's just displacing flesh. And so when you displace flesh from your waist, it has to go somewhere. And on most bodies, it tends to go downwards. So especially that high hip increases by quite a bit if you reduce any. And because in a modern corsetry, the patterning technique doesn't really allow for a place for the flesh to go. That is why modern corsetry can very easily create those lines on top or bottom. Most historical corsets are made to that ideal silhouette with a very small waist and big hips and big bust. And if you didn't actually fill it out yourself, you'd use bust improvers, hip improvers to fill out those hollow bits. And that is how most historical corsetry was made. And also because you allow for that room for that flesh to go to, it doesn't actually put as much strain on the corset and the fabrics themselves as does a modern corset. And I'm not saying that one is better than the other, they just serve a different purpose. And they are made differently for a different reason. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something new or interesting from this video. If you did, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already so that I can see you again next time. Bye!